Very golden. And actually, that's why we have United We Stand. We need to unite so we can stand together. In our format today, I shall pose a question and then direct it to the panel member. After the answer is complete, I welcome any panelists to add further on the topic. So we'll start with the executions of the Coptic Christians in Libya brought the pearl of ISIS to Egypt's doorstep. What is the risk for their incursion into Egypt itself? And I would like to start with Dr. London.
Well, there is no doubt that the Muslim Brotherhood has spawned a good many terrorist organizations. Not merely the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood established in 1928, but people do not realize that it was the money from the Muslim Brotherhood that established Al-Qaeda in the first place. Jordanians were largely responsible. Muslim Brotherhood members of Jordan were largely responsible for it. Now, what I think is critical is that the roughly 500,000 members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt do represent a threat. There is no question. When we in the United States speak cavalierly of human rights violations in Egypt, we overlook the fact that there are 500,000 potential terrorists in Egypt that want to kill al-Sisi and want to destroy the government. Even though that is a relatively tiny portion of the 90 million in the society, it represents a very serious threat. So my feeling is that we are not seeing an end to this situation. And we will see that there is more violence in Egypt and across the Middle East. It is just the beginning. We are going to engage in a long, long war. And as I indicated before, the war is not merely a military battle. It's also an ideological battle, which is one of the reasons why I was so impressed with the speech that President El-Sisi gave at Al-Azhar. That struck me as a very important ideological point, because you have to be able to make the argument that there's something wrong. There's something fundamentally wrong with the arguments that are being made by the Muslim Brotherhood. So we've got to fight on two fronts. One, on the battlefield, where it's necessary to defeat the Muslim Brotherhood, but two, defeat them ideologically as well.
Dr. London, do you think the Egyptian government should have taken permission from the White House before they airstrike Libya, in other words?
Let me make it perfectly clear. The Egyptian government does not have to rely on the White House to engage in an attack. There was every justification for doing so after the 21 cops were killed. But I think that there's been a terrible mistake that's been made by this White House. And the mistake is not recognizing the fact that when the second revolution in Egypt occurred, we called it, that is, this administration called it, a military coup. When it was called a military coup, there are legislative restrictions against dealing with a nation that's a military coup. This, by no stretch of the imagination, was a military coup. When there were 33 million people on the streets, that's a popular uprising. That's a revolution. That's not a military coup. The president had it all wrong. And he's not the only one. There's been bipartisan, I think, mistakes, because there are Republicans who have maintained the same position. It's a misguided perception. And it's a perception that still exists. It is having a very, very negative effect on the way in which Egypt is thought about in the United States. President El-Sisi, and let me make this clear, did not engage in a military coup. This was not a coup. He was merely a representative of what became a national uprising. And I think that until the United States government understands that very obvious fact, there will be continual pressure put on Egypt through the United States in the desire to obtain Apaches, which are needed to fight the war in the Sinai, for the tanks that have been promised and have not been delivered, for the F-16s that have been promised and not delivered. Again, it's all based on this misguided perception about what transpired in Egypt.
Dr. London, on Sunday, President Sisi called for pan-Arab military coalition to combat ISIS. This is a reminiscent of Nasser. How likely is that coalition to happen?
I think that already exists. I mean, frankly, as I indicated before, it's an informal condominium that exists with Sunni nations very much concerned about Iran. And the Iranian strategy is also very clear. What Iran wants is, of course, the Saudi oil fields. The Saudi oil fields are located in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. This is Shia area. They want to unite the Shia, and they believe they have the ability to do that. In addition, with the Houthi taking over Yemen, and of course the Iranian Revolutionary Guard being present in that country, what you now have is the portals to the Red Sea, as well as the Gulf of Hormuz, are now controlled by the Iranians, which means in effect that Saudi Arabia is surrounded. So you have capitals that is Shia capitals in Lebanon, in Damascus, in Sana'a, in Baghdad, what it suggests is that an empire is being created by the Iranians. The threat is as significant as ISIS because the leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world is Iran. So now those nations deeply concerned about the spread of Iranian influence will unite. They are uniting. And again, it may be de facto, not de jure, but there is no question about what this means. It means that a defense arrangement is being created. And the United States should provide both the diplomatic and logistical support for it, but we are not doing so, which explains and why that President El-Sisi went to Russia to buy $2 billion worth of Russian arms because he can't get those arms from the United States. So I think that you're already seeing it. It's not a question of whether it will happen. It already exists in the world.
Dr. London, what Americans can do to identify and prevent young U.S. recruits from joining ISIS?
Well, I mean, I've answered that question. I kind of anticipated your question. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that our schools are failing. And they're failing because we have come to the conclusion that there's a kind of moral relativism in the world. And that like, after all, they have their point of view, we have our point of view. We are unwilling to recognize the fact that there is something superior about the West. My friend Ayaan Hirsi Ali told me this story. It was a very poignant story. She left Somalia, as you know, went to Holland, and she's living in Holland, and is walking down the corridor with a fellow, and they come to a door. And when they come to the door, he says to her, "Ladies first." She stands frozen in her place. Tears start to roll down her cheeks. She had never heard the expression, "ladies first." In her world, ladies were last, always. Not only were they last, they were not even human, only half human, and certainly had no recognition in a court of law. That suggested to her there is something superior about the West. We should be able to say that. And it's very, very difficult to make that argument when people do not understand what a tradition stands for, why we are a unique nation, and what kind of attitudes, cultural attitudes, we convey or should convey among young people in the United States.